When both pilots collapsed at 35,000 feet, terrified passengers waited for death. Then a small voice broke the silence. An 11-year-old girl stood up and said four impossible words: "I can fly it." Adults laughed until they realized she was their only hope. 147 lives now depended on a sixth grader nobody believed in. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the airport terminal windows as 11-year-old Maya Chen sat quietly in the unaccompanied minor waiting area, her purple backpack resting against her chair and her tablet displaying what looked like a simple puzzle game. The airline staff member assigned to watch over young solo travelers smiled at her warmly, speaking in that gentle, simplified tone adults often used with children. "Your flight boards in 20 minutes, sweetie. Are you excited to visit your aunt in Denver?" Maya nodded politely, her dark eyes barely leaving her screen, giving every appearance of being just another elementary school student making a routine trip during spring break. The gate agent had already attached the bright yellow lanyard around her neck that identified her as an unaccompanied minor, a visual signal to every crew member and passenger that this was a child traveling alone who needed extra supervision and care. When boarding began, Maya was escorted onto the aircraft first, ahead of the premium passengers, as airline policy required for children traveling without parents. The senior flight attendant, a kind woman named Patricia with 20 years of experience, personally guided Maya to her window seat in row 12, helping her stow her backpack in the overhead compartment and showing her where the safety card was located. "Have you flown before, honey?" Patricia asked, speaking slowly and clearly as if Maya might struggle with complex sentences. "If you need anything during the flight, just press this button and one of us will come help you, okay?" Maya thanked her softly, her voice small and young, already pulling out a book about horses from her bag while Patricia moved down the aisle to help other passengers. The business travelers settling into nearby seats barely glanced at the small girl by the window, seeing only what everyone saw, a 5th or 6th grader with a neat ponytail, wearing sneakers with cartoon characters on them, clutching a stuffed animal keychain attached to her backpack strap. She was invisible in the way children often are to busy adults focused on their own concerns. As passengers continued boarding, Maya appeared completely absorbed in her book, occasionally glancing out the window at the ground crew loading luggage below. The middle-aged man who took the aisle seat in her row offered her a brief smile before opening his laptop, already mentally preparing for his business meetings in Denver. He noticed her coloring book peeking out from the seat pocket and assumed she would spend the flight drawing pictures or watching cartoons on the entertainment system like most kids her age. The woman across the aisle watched Maya with the protective instinct many adults feel toward unaccompanied children on flights, mentally noting to keep an eye on her if she seemed nervous or needed help. Nobody knew that beneath Maya's ordinary appearance lay knowledge that would soon become the difference between life and death for every person aboard Flight 2847. The truth about Maya Chen was extraordinary, though she had learned early to hide it from adults who would never understand. Her father had been a commercial airline captain, a skilled pilot who had flown for 30 years before a sudden heart attack took him from her life just 18 months ago. But during the precious years before his death, he had done something unusual, something that started as a game when Maya was barely 7 years old. He had begun teaching her to fly, not in real aircraft at first, but through professional-grade flight simulator software that he used at home to practice emergency procedures and maintain his skills. What began as a father showing his curious daughter his work had evolved into something far more serious as he recognized her photographic memory and natural understanding of flight mechanics. By age 8, Maya could recite emergency checklists from memory. By 9, she could perform simulated engine failures and electrical emergencies with calm precision. By 10, she had logged over 2,000 hours in the simulator, practicing everything from normal takeoffs and landings to catastrophic system failures that would terrify experienced pilots. Her father had also taken her to youth aviation programs at the local airport, where children could sit in actual cockpits and learn about flight controls from retired pilots who volunteered their time. Maya had absorbed everything, asking questions that surprised the instructors with their depth and insight. She had watched countless hours of cockpit footage, studied pilot training manuals that she borrowed from her father's bookshelf, and developed an obsessive dedication to understanding every aspect of how commercial aircraft operated. After her father died, the simulator became her refuge, a way to feel close to him and honor his memory. Her mother, overwhelmed with grief and struggling to pay bills as a single parent, had no idea how advanced Maya's knowledge had become. She saw only a young girl who liked playing flight games on the computer, a harmless hobby that kept her daughter occupied and connected to her late father's profession. Now, as Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Maya listened to the familiar sounds of jet engines spooling up with recognition that would have shocked everyone around her. She knew that the slight bump was the nose wheel passing over expansion joints in the taxiway. She recognized the different engine tones as the pilots adjusted thrust for turns. She felt the aircraft pause at the runway hold short line, waiting for takeoff clearance from air traffic control. When the engines roared to full power and the massive Boeing 737 accelerated down the runway, Maya closed her eyes and felt the exact moment when the pilots rotated the aircraft, pulling back on the controls to lift the nose wheel off the ground at precisely the right speed. Her simulator training had taught her to recognize every sensation, every sound, every movement that adults around her experienced as merely the routine miracle of flight. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, showing passengers how to fasten seatbelts and where emergency exits were located. Maya didn't need to watch because she had memorized every safety procedure years ago, but she kept her eyes politely forward anyway, maintaining the appearance of being an obedient child following adult instructions. Patricia came by to check on her once the seatbelt sign turned off, bringing her a pack of cookies and asking if she wanted juice or soda. "You're being such a good traveler," Patricia said warmly, patting Maya's shoulder. "Some kids get nervous on planes, but you seem very calm." Maya smiled shyly and accepted the cookies, not mentioning that she felt more comfortable on aircraft than almost anywhere else in the world. This was her element, the place where her father's legacy lived, even if nobody around her could possibly know that. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft leveled off into smooth cruising flight. The captain made an announcement welcoming passengers aboard and mentioning their estimated arrival time in Denver, his voice confident and professional over the intercom system. Maya recognized good piloting technique in the steady, vibration-free flight, the mark of experienced crew members who had trimmed the aircraft perfectly for cruise. She returned to her book, genuinely enjoying the story about wild horses while simultaneously remaining aware of every subtle change in engine tone or aircraft attitude. The business traveler beside her was already asleep, his laptop closed on his tray table. Other passengers read, worked, or watched movies on their personal screens. It was a routine flight, unremarkable in every way, exactly the kind of safe and boring journey that millions of people experienced every single day. Nobody noticed when the first officer in the cockpit began to feel dizzy. Nobody saw when the captain's vision started to blur. The two pilots had eaten breakfast together at the hotel that morning, both choosing the same egg dish from the buffet. Neither realized that the food had been contaminated with bacteria that was now attacking their systems with devastating speed. The first officer tried to shake off the growing nausea, assuming it was just turbulence affecting his stomach, but within minutes his hands began to tremble on the controls. The captain felt intense cramping in his abdomen and reached for his water bottle with a shaking hand, trying to fight off the waves of dizziness that were making the instrument seem to swim before his eyes. They were both professional pilots with thousands of hours of experience, trained to handle emergencies and maintain safety even under pressure, but their bodies were shutting down faster than either man could comprehend. In the passenger cabin, Patricia was preparing the beverage cart for mid-flight service when she heard the cockpit call button chime. This was unusual during cruise flight, but she immediately set down the coffee pot and headed toward the front of the aircraft. Through the reinforced cockpit door window, she could see the first officer slumped sideways in his seat, clearly unconscious. Her heart began to race as she entered the security code to open the door, her training suddenly taking over as she realized something was terribly wrong. The sight that greeted her when the door swung open would haunt her for the rest of her life. Both pilots were unconscious, the captain's head resting against the side window and the first officer collapsed forward against his harness. The aircraft was flying on autopilot, maintaining altitude and heading without human input, but both crew members who were supposed to be managing the complex systems were completely incapacitated. Patricia's hands shook as she pressed the call button to summon the other flight attendants, her mind racing through emergency procedures that she had practiced in training but never expected to face in reality. Within seconds, her colleagues rushed forward, their faces going pale as they saw the unconscious pilots. "Check their pulses," Patricia ordered, her voice tight with controlled panic. "And get the emergency medical kit." Both pilots were breathing but completely unresponsive, their bodies limp and their eyes closed. Whatever had struck them down had done so with terrifying speed and completeness. The senior flight attendant knew immediately that they were facing a catastrophic emergency. Without conscious pilots, the aircraft could maintain its current altitude and heading until fuel ran out, but it could not navigate to an airport, manage approach procedures, or execute the complex landing sequence that would save the lives of everyone aboard. The public address system crackled to life as Patricia forced herself to remain calm, knowing that passenger panic could make an already desperate situation even worse. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant speaking. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit, and I need to ask if there are any licensed pilots currently on board. If you have flying experience of any kind, please press your call button immediately." Her voice was steady, but passengers recognized the underlying urgency and the cabin erupted into confused murmurs and fearful whispers. The business travelers who had been working on laptops looked up in alarm. Parents grabbed their children's hands. The woman across the aisle from Maya felt her stomach drop as the implications of the announcement registered. A medical emergency in the cockpit could only mean one thing: something had happened to the pilots. Seconds passed like hours as Patricia and the other flight attendants scanned the cabin desperately, praying for call buttons to light up, for someone to raise their hand and announce they had flying experience. But no buttons chimed. No hands went up. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, many of them beginning to understand the horrifying truth that was settling over the aircraft like a death sentence. Without conscious pilots, they were flying in a metal tube at 35,000 feet with no way to land, no way to navigate to safety, no way to save themselves when fuel eventually ran out or systems failed. Some passengers began to cry quietly. Others pulled out phones to send final messages to loved ones, even though the phones showed no signal. The reality of their situation was becoming impossible to deny. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt with steady hands, her young heart beating fast but her mind remarkably clear. She stood up in her row, her small frame barely reaching the shoulder height of nearby adults, and spoke in her clear, young voice that somehow carried through the cabin despite the growing panic around her. "I can fly it." The words hung in the air for a moment, so unexpected and impossible that several passengers actually laughed, the sound harsh and bitter with hysteria. The businessman in Maya's row turned to stare at her, his face showing a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Honey, sit down," he said, not unkindly but with the automatic dismissal adults show children during serious situations. "The flight attendants will handle this." But Maya didn't sit down. She stepped into the aisle and walked toward the front of the aircraft with a calmness that seemed impossible for an 11-year-old facing the stares of terrified adults. Patricia saw her approaching and felt her heart sink even further. This was a child, an elementary school student who probably thought flying meant playing games on an iPad. "Sweetheart, you need to go back to your seat," Patricia said gently, trying to guide Maya back down the aisle even as her mind screamed that there were no other options, that this child represented the only person who had volunteered when asked for pilot experience. "This isn't something you can help with. I've logged over 2,000 hours in a Boeing 737 flight simulator," Maya said quietly, her young voice carrying an authority that made Patricia freeze. "My father was Captain Robert Chen with Pacific Airlines. He taught me to fly before he died. I know emergency procedures and I can follow air traffic control instructions. I'm the only chance everyone on this plane has right now, and you know it." The words were so completely unexpected, delivered in such a calm and factual tone by such a young child, that Patricia felt her assumptions shatter. She looked into Maya's dark eyes and saw something that terrified and reassured her at the same time: absolute certainty, complete understanding, and a calmness that exceeded what many adults in the cabin were currently showing. The other flight attendants had gathered near the cockpit door, their faces showing the desperate calculation of people with no good options. "She's just a kid," one of them whispered urgently to Patricia. "We can't let a child fly this aircraft. It's insane." But Patricia was remembering her emergency training, remembering the protocols that said in a total crew incapacitation scenario, any person with any flying knowledge should be utilized because the alternative was certain death for everyone aboard. She looked at Maya again, seeing the purple backpack and the stuffed animal keychain, seeing the small hands and the young face that should be worried about homework and friends, not about flying a commercial airliner carrying 147 souls. But she also saw the steady gaze, the calm demeanor, and heard the accurate aviation terminology that no 11-year-old should know unless they had genuinely absorbed knowledge through exceptional circumstances. "Can you really do this?" Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper, knowing that the next decision she made would determine whether everyone aboard lived or died. Maya nodded once, her face serious and focused. "I'll need air traffic control to guide me through procedures I haven't practiced enough, but I understand the aircraft systems and I know how to fly. My simulator at home is certified commercial-grade software that pilots use for training. I've practiced engine failures, electrical emergencies, and emergency landings hundreds of times. I know I'm only 11 years old, but I can do this if you let me try." The words should have sounded like childish fantasy, like make-believe from a kid who had watched too many movies. But something in Maya's tone, in her choice of words, in the way she stood there without trembling or showing fear while adults around her were falling apart, made Patricia believe her. The senior flight attendant made her decision in that moment, knowing she would face questions and criticism later if they survived, knowing that allowing a child into the cockpit to attempt flying a commercial aircraft violated every instinct and probably every regulation in existence. But she also knew that without conscious pilots, everyone aboard was already dead unless someone took control. "Okay," Patricia said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "Okay. Come with me." She led Maya toward the cockpit door, ignoring the shocked protests from the other flight attendants and the growing murmur of disbelief from passengers who were beginning to understand that their survival might depend on a sixth grader. Maya stepped through the cockpit door and felt an unexpected sense of coming home. This was the environment she knew from thousands of hours of simulator practice, from youth aviation programs, from sitting beside her father as he explained systems and procedures with the patience of someone who loved sharing his passion. The unconscious pilots were strapped in their seats, their bodies slack and unresponsive. Patricia and another flight attendant carefully moved the captain from his seat, struggling with his weight as they positioned him on the cockpit floor where they could monitor his breathing. Maya climbed into the captain's seat, her feet barely reaching the rudder pedals even when she adjusted the seat all the way forward. The familiar instruments surrounded her, the primary flight display showing altitude and airspeed, the navigation display showing their route, the engine instruments displaying thrust settings and fuel flow, the autopilot panel showing the modes currently engaged. Her small hands moved across the controls with practiced confidence as she checked the autopilot status, confirmed that the aircraft was maintaining altitude and heading, and noted their current position from the navigation display. Everything her father had taught her, everything she had practiced alone in the dark hours after his death, suddenly felt real and immediate. She reached for the radio panel and switched to the frequency she could see was already selected, the frequency that would connect her to air traffic control for their current sector. Taking a deep breath, Maya pressed the transmit button and spoke in her clear young voice, using the exact phraseology her father had drilled into her during their practice sessions. "Denver Center, this is Pacific Flight 2847, we have an emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated and I'm an 11-year-old passenger who has taken the controls. Request immediate assistance and guidance for emergency landing procedures." The controller's response came through the headset after a long pause that Maya knew represented shock and disbelief in the control tower. "Pacific 2847, please repeat your last transmission." The controller's voice was carefully controlled, probably assuming he had misheard or that this was some kind of prank. Maya pressed the transmit button again, keeping her voice steady. Denver Center, Pacific 2847. Both crew members are unconscious from apparent food poisoning or medical emergency. I am 11 years old with approximately 2,000 hours of flight simulator experience in Boeing 737 aircraft. I understand basic flight operations and I can follow guidance, but I need step-by-step assistance to navigate to suitable airport and execute landing procedures. We have 147 souls on board and approximately 3 hours of fuel remaining. The frequency went silent for several seconds, and Maya could imagine the chaos that her transmission was causing in the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center. Controllers were probably conferring urgently with supervisors, checking if this was possible, wondering if they were dealing with an actual emergency or an elaborate hoax. But the urgency in her voice and the specific details she had provided, aircraft type, souls on board, fuel state, were not things that a child playing a prank would typically know. Pacific 2847, please state your current position and altitude. The controller's voice was professional now, all business, and Maya felt a surge of relief that they were taking her seriously. She read off the coordinates from the navigation display and confirmed their altitude of 35,000 feet, adding their current heading and airspeed. The controller asked her to squawk 7700 on the transponder, the universal emergency code, and Maya's fingers found the transponder panel without hesitation, entering the 4 digits that would make their aircraft flash as an emergency on every radar screen in range. In the Denver Center control room, controllers were scrambling to coordinate the most unprecedented emergency in aviation history. Supervisors were calling airline operations centers, contacting Boeing technical support, arranging for emergency vehicles to be positioned at nearby airports. The controller assigned to Pacific 2847 was a 20-year veteran named Jim Harrison, who had guided troubled aircraft through countless emergencies, but he had never faced anything like this. An 11-year-old child was sitting in the captain's seat of a Boeing 737 at 35,000 feet, responsible for 147 lives, and Jim had to somehow guide her through procedures that challenged even experienced pilots. He forced himself to focus on the task, breaking down what needed to happen into smallest possible steps, treating this like he was talking someone through their first flight lesson, except that the stakes were hundreds of lives instead of a practice session. Pacific 2847, you're doing great, Jim said into his microphone, his voice calm and reassuring despite the sweat forming on his forehead. I need you to tell me what experience you have. What have you practiced on the simulator? Maya's young voice came back steady and clear. I've practiced normal takeoffs and landings, engine failures at various stages of flight, electrical system failures, emergency descents, and instrument approach procedures. My simulator is X-Plane Professional Edition with the PMDG 737 add-on that replicates real aircraft systems. My father was Captain Robert Chen, Pacific Airlines, and he taught me procedures before he died 18 months ago. Jim felt his throat tighten as he realized this was actually real, that this child had somehow absorbed genuine aviation knowledge through exceptional circumstances, and now everyone's survival depended on whether that knowledge would translate to flying an actual aircraft. Okay, that's very helpful information, Jim responded, already pulling up technical manuals and approach plates for nearby airports on his screen. Right now the autopilot is flying the aircraft, and that's good. We're going to leave it engaged while we go through some checks and make a plan. First, I need you to check the fuel quantity indicators. They should be on the overhead panel. Can you see them? Maya tilted her head back to look at the overhead panel, her eyes finding the fuel gauges exactly where she knew they would be from her simulator practice. Center tank shows approximately 2,000 pounds, left main tank shows approximately 10,000 pounds, right main tank shows approximately 10,000 pounds. Jim copied the numbers, calculating that they had about 2.5 hours of flying time remaining, which gave them options but not unlimited time to figure this out. Back in the passenger cabin, word had spread that an 11-year-old girl was in the cockpit trying to fly the aircraft. Some passengers refused to believe it, insisting it had to be a mistake or misunderstanding. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds unable to process the impossible situation. A few parents held their children close, whispering prayers, or comforting words while fighting back their own terror. The businessman who had sat beside Maya in row 12 kept shaking his head, remembering the small girl with the coloring book and cartoon sneakers, unable to reconcile that image with the idea of a child flying a commercial airliner. Patricia moved through the cabin trying to keep people calm, explaining that the young passenger had extensive simulator training and that air traffic control was providing guidance, but her words did little to ease the fear that was thick in the air. In the cockpit, Maya was working through checks that Jim was guiding her through, verifying that aircraft systems were functioning normally and that there were no additional problems beyond the incapacitated pilots. Her simulator training had prepared her for exactly this kind of systematic check, and she responded to Jim's questions with accuracy that began to give the controller hope that maybe, impossibly, this might actually work. Pacific 2847, we're going to divert you to Colorado Springs Airport, Jim said, pulling up the airport information on his screen. It's about 60 miles ahead of your current position, and it has a long runway with emergency equipment available. We're going to start by having you program the flight management computer to go to Colorado Springs. Have you done FMC programming on the simulator? Affirmative, Maya responded, her hands already moving to the FMC between the captain and first officer seats. I'll need the airport identifier code. Jim provided the code, KCOS, and talked Maya through the steps of bringing up the flight plan page, inserting the diversion airport as a new destination, and executing the change. Her small fingers worked the buttons carefully, following Jim's instructions and cross-checking each step against what she had practiced countless times in her simulator. When she pressed the execute button, the aircraft began a gentle turn to the new heading, the autopilot following the updated flight plan that would take them toward Colorado Springs. Maya watched the navigation display update, showing their new route, and confirmed the turn to Jim. In the control tower at Colorado Springs, emergency crews were being mobilized, fire trucks were positioning near the runway, and airport operations staff were coordinating with airline representatives to prepare for an arrival that nobody could quite believe was happening. "Okay, you're doing really well," Jim said, meaning every word. "Next we need to start descending from 35,000 feet. We're going to do this very gradually and carefully. I want you to find the altitude select knob on the autopilot panel. It should have numbers on it showing your current altitude setting." Maya located the knob exactly where she knew it would be, her simulator training making the layout feel familiar even though this was the first time she had touched actual aircraft controls. "I see it. Currently set to 35000. Jim walked her through rotating the knob to select a lower altitude, explaining that the autopilot would begin a gentle descent when she pulled the knob out to engage the new setting. Maya followed his instructions precisely, and felt the aircraft's nose drop slightly as the autopilot began reducing altitude at a safe rate. The descent would take approximately 15 minutes to reach 10,000 feet, where Jim planned to have Maya level off while they worked on approach preparations. During that time, Jim consulted with Boeing technical representatives who had been contacted by the airline, getting their input on how to guide someone with no actual aircraft experience through the complex landing procedures. Everyone agreed that keeping the autopilot engaged as long as possible was crucial, letting the automated systems handle the precise control inputs while Maya managed the overall sequence with Jim's guidance. The challenge would come during the final approach when she would need to disconnect the autopilot and hand-fly the aircraft to landing, a task that required feel and experience that no simulator could fully replicate. As the aircraft descended through 25,000 feet, Patricia came to the cockpit door and spoke quietly to Maya. "How are you doing, honey?" The question was absurd given the circumstances, but Maya appreciated the kindness behind it. "I'm okay. Air traffic control is helping me and the autopilot is doing most of the work right now." She didn't mention that her hands were trembling slightly from adrenaline, or that she was trying not to think about the 147 people whose lives depended on her successfully executing procedures she had only ever practiced in simulation. Patricia squeezed Maya's shoulder gently. "Everyone out there is praying for you. You're the bravest person I've ever met." Maya managed a small smile but kept her eyes on the instruments, monitoring the descent and watching for any system warnings or abnormalities. Jim guided Maya through the descent checklist, having her verify that pressurization was adjusting properly, that engines were responding normally to the reduced thrust settings, and that fuel flow was stable. Each successful check increased his confidence that the aircraft systems were functioning correctly, eliminating variables that could complicate the already challenging situation. As they descended through 15,000 feet, Jim began explaining the approach procedure they would use, a visual approach to runway 17 left at Colorado Springs, which was nearly 2 miles long and provided plenty of room for error. He talked Maya through what would happen during the approach. They would slow down gradually, extend flaps in stages to increase lift at lower speeds, lower the landing gear when they were properly configured, and then make a gentle descent to the runway following a standard glide path. At 10,000 feet, Maya leveled the aircraft as Jim had instructed, adjusting the altitude select knob and watching the vertical speed indicator return to 0 as the autopilot maintained their new altitude. They were now about 30 miles from Colorado Springs, flying at a comfortable speed with plenty of time to complete pre-landing preparations. Jim had Maya switch radio frequencies to Colorado Springs Tower, where a different controller named Sarah began coordinating their arrival. Sarah's voice was warm and encouraging, treating Maya like a student pilot on a training flight rather than an 11-year-old in a catastrophic emergency. Pacific 2847, welcome to Colorado Springs. We have emergency equipment standing by and you have priority for landing on runway 17 left. The weather is clear, winds are light, and you're going to do just fine. Maya appreciated the controller's confidence even though her own nervousness was growing as the reality of actually landing the aircraft approached. She had landed thousands of times in the simulator, but she knew that real aircraft behaved differently, that the feedback through the controls was different, that the consequences of mistakes were fatal rather than simply requiring a restart. But she forced herself to focus on what her father had taught her. Aviation was about following procedures, maintaining calm, and trusting your training even when circumstances were difficult. She began working through the approach checklist that Sarah was providing, confirming that pressurization was set for landing, that the landing gear handle was in the up position for now, that the flap lever was at 0 degrees until they were ready to begin configuration. At 20 miles from the airport, Sarah instructed Maya to begin slowing the aircraft and extending the first increment of flaps. Jim, still monitoring on the Denver frequency, talked her through reducing the throttles to begin decelerating and then moving the flap lever to the first detent position. Maya felt the aircraft's nose pitch up slightly as the flaps deployed, increasing drag and changing the aircraft's flight characteristics. She watched the airspeed indicator carefully, making sure they were slowing to the appropriate speed for that flap setting. Sarah confirmed that she could see the aircraft on radar, tracking perfectly toward the runway, and cleared Maya to descend to 7,000 feet. Maya adjusted the altitude select knob again, initiating another descent while maintaining the slower airspeed appropriate for their current configuration. At 15 miles and 7,000 feet, Sarah had Maya extend more flaps and slow further, gradually configuring the aircraft for landing while maintaining stable flight. Each flap extension changed how the aircraft handled, and Maya could feel the difference in the controls, the way the aircraft wanted to pitch up and slow down with each change. She made small adjustments to thrust and pitch, keeping the descent rate smooth and the airspeed within safe limits. At 10 miles out, Sarah instructed her to lower the landing gear, and Maya's hand found the gear lever on the center pedestal. She moved the lever to the down position and heard the hydraulic whine as the gear doors opened and the massive landing gear legs extended below the aircraft. 3 green lights illuminated on the instrument panel, confirming that all 3 gear were down and locked. The aircraft shook slightly from the increased drag, and Maya added a bit of thrust to maintain airspeed. "Perfect, Maya," Sarah said, using her name now, treating her like a person rather than just a call sign. "Your gear is down and locked, and you're configured for landing. At 5 miles I'm going to have you disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the rest of the approach. I know that sounds scary, but you've practiced this. The aircraft will do what you tell it to do. Small control movements, watch your airspeed and descent rate, and keep the runway centered in front of you. You can do this." Maya's heart was pounding now, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. The autopilot had been flying the aircraft perfectly, but landing required human input, required feel and judgment that no automated system could provide. She wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans and gripped the control yoke, feeling the slight resistance and movement as the autopilot made micro-corrections to maintain the flight path. At 5 miles, Sarah gave the instruction Maya had been dreading and anticipating. Pacific 2847, you can disconnect the autopilot now. Press the red button on the yoke. Maya's thumb found the autopilot disconnect button and pressed it firmly. The familiar beep sounded in her headset, and suddenly the aircraft was responding only to her inputs. For a terrifying moment she felt the aircraft start to drift right, and she instinctively applied left pressure to the yoke, centering the wings and bringing the flight path back to the runway centerline. The controls felt different than the simulator, more responsive and more alive, and Maya had to consciously gentle her inputs to avoid over-controlling. Sarah talked her through every step, reminding her to check airspeed, watch altitude, keep the descent rate steady at about 700 feet per minute. The runway appeared ahead, a long gray strip of concrete that looked impossibly small from their current altitude. Maya focused on keeping it centered in the windscreen, making tiny corrections with the yoke and rudder pedals, her feet barely able to apply meaningful pressure but doing their best. She could hear Patricia's voice in the cabin making an announcement telling passengers to prepare for landing, to ensure seatbelts were fastened and seats were upright, trying to maintain some semblance of normal procedure despite the extraordinary circumstances. At 3 miles, Maya was maintaining the glide path well, her simulator training translating into real-world aircraft control better than she had dared hope. The aircraft was stable, configured correctly, and tracking straight toward the runway. Emergency vehicles were visible beside the runway, red and white trucks with flashing lights positioned in case something went wrong. Sarah's voice was steady and calm, guiding Maya through the final approach. "You're doing beautifully. Airspeed is good at 140 knots, descent rate is perfect, you're right on the centerline. At 50 feet above the runway I'm going to tell you to start reducing throttles and beginning your flare. That means you'll pull back gently on the yoke to raise the nose and slow your descent. The main gear will touch first, then you'll lower the nose gear gently. After touchdown, pull the throttles to idle and apply brakes carefully." Maya acknowledged the instructions, her whole world narrowing to the runway ahead, the instruments in front of her, and Sarah's guiding voice in her headset. She had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times, but her hands were shaking and her breath was coming fast despite her efforts to remain calm. The runway grew larger in the windscreen, concrete and markings becoming clear and distinct. The radio altimeter counted down their height above the ground, 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. "Start your flare," Sarah called. Maya pulled back gently on the yoke, raising the nose and feeling the aircraft's descent slow. The throttles came back to idle under her left hand. For a moment they seemed to float, suspended between sky and ground, and then she felt the main gear touch the runway with a firm but controlled bump. She held the nose up for a few more seconds as speed bled off, then let the nose gear settle onto the concrete. Her feet found the brake pedals and applied pressure carefully, feeling the massive aircraft slow under her control. They were down. They were safe. She had actually done it. The aircraft rolled down the runway at decreasing speed, Maya keeping it centered with small rudder inputs, the emergency vehicles following alongside at a distance. When they slowed to taxi speed, Sarah instructed Maya to turn off at the next taxiway and bring the aircraft to a complete stop. Maya's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely work the tiller control to steer, but she managed to guide the aircraft off the runway and onto the taxiway before setting the parking brake. The engines were still running at idle, the system still operating, but the immediate danger was over. They had landed safely at Colorado Springs, every passenger and crew member alive because an 11-year-old girl had possessed knowledge that should have been impossible for someone her age. Patricia was crying as she opened the cockpit door, tears of relief streaming down her face. She pulled Maya into a tight hug, unable to find words adequate for what had just happened. Through the cockpit windows, Maya could see emergency personnel approaching the aircraft, could see airport vehicles surrounding them, could see the gathering crowd of officials and media that had assembled to witness the impossible landing. Sarah's voice came through the headset one more time, thick with emotion. "Maya, that was the most incredible piece of flying I have ever witnessed. You saved every life on that aircraft. Your father would be so proud of you." The medical team that rushed aboard attended first to the unconscious pilots, who were both showing signs of severe food poisoning but would survive with treatment. Patricia explained to the paramedics what had happened, how the 11-year-old girl sitting in the captain's seat had taken control and landed the aircraft when no one else could. The passengers, many of them still crying or in shock, began to realize that the child they had dismissed and underestimated had been the only thing standing between them and certain death. The businessman from row 12 couldn't stop staring at Maya, remembering how he had told her to sit down when she volunteered to help, how close he had come to preventing the only person who could save them from reaching the cockpit. Airport officials needed to tow the aircraft to a gate, and an experienced pilot was brought aboard to shut down the engines and secure the systems. He shook Maya's hand with genuine respect, telling her that what she had accomplished was extraordinary even for pilots with thousands of hours of real flight time. As passengers deplaned down the air stairs that had been rolled to the aircraft, many of them stopped to thank Maya, to touch her shoulder or squeeze her hand, unable to articulate the depth of gratitude they felt toward the small girl who had refused to be dismissed when every adult instinct told people she couldn't possibly help. News of the emergency landing spread rapidly. Within hours, Maya's story was on every major news network, aviation experts analyzing the cockpit voice recordings and marveling at how a child with only simulator experience had managed procedures that challenged professional pilots. Her mother, reached by phone in tears of shock and pride, explained about Maya's father and the training he had given her, about the thousands of hours of practice that nobody had realized represented actual skill development rather than just a child's game. The FAA launched an investigation not to assign blame but to understand how such an unprecedented event had occurred and what lessons could be learned. Boeing representatives requested copies of Maya's simulator software to study how effectively their training materials translated to real-world capability. In the days that followed, Maya struggled to process what had happened. She was just a sixth grader who missed her father and found comfort in flight simulation, suddenly thrust into international fame as the 11-year-old who saved 147 lives. Schools requested her presence to talk to students about pursuing their passions. Aviation organizations offered scholarships for future pilot training. Airlines wanted to discuss her eventual career once she was old enough to earn an actual pilot's license. But Maya mostly wanted to return to normal life, to homework and friends and the quiet moments at her simulator where she still felt closest to her father. The passengers of Flight 2847 formed a group they called Maya's Crew, staying in touch and meeting annually to celebrate their survival and honor the young girl who had refused to let them die. They established a scholarship fund in her name for young people interested in aviation. Patricia remained close to Maya, often calling to check on her and reminding her that she was the bravest person Patricia had ever met. The controllers, Jim and Sarah, received commendations for their guidance during the emergency, but both insisted that the real hero was the child who had kept her calm and followed instructions when experienced adults around her were panicking. On the first anniversary of the emergency landing, Maya stood at her father's grave and told him about the flight, about how his patient teaching and faith in her abilities had saved all those lives. She told him that she still practiced on the simulator, that she still dreamed of being a commercial pilot someday, that his legacy lived on through her passion for aviation. The purple backpack with the stuffed animal keychain was retired to her closet, a reminder of who she had been before the world knew her name. But the love of flying remained, stronger than ever, a connection between a daughter and her father that had transformed from tragedy into triumph at 35,000 feet. The aircraft itself, after repairs and maintenance, returned to service with a small placard in the cockpit commemorating the emergency landing and honoring Maya's courage. Pilots who flew that particular aircraft knew its history and felt a special responsibility to honor the memory of what had happened there, how an 11-year-old girl had sat in the captain's seat and proven that knowledge, training, and calm determination could overcome even the most impossible circumstances. Flight attendants who worked aboard that aircraft often told the story to curious passengers, reminding them that heroes come in unexpected forms and that we should never underestimate what people are capable of achieving when lives depend on their courage. Maya Chen's story became part of aviation history, studied in emergency response training and used as an example of exceptional resource management. But for Maya herself, the most important outcome was honoring her father's memory and proving that his investment in teaching her, his patience in answering her endless questions, and his belief that she could understand complex subjects despite her youth had all been worthwhile. She had been given knowledge as a gift of love, and when the moment came, that knowledge had saved lives. No greater tribute to her father's legacy could exist than the 147 people walking around alive because he had taught his daughter to fly.